Tony Evers also responding to the unrest in Los Angeles during a stop in Green Bay today, saying he's paying close attention, fearing the impact it could have on Wisconsin if undocumented workers not charged with a crime are deported. Chief political reporter Jason Zimmerman asked the governor more about that question. He's live in the studio with the response. Jason.
Cami, just like California Governor Gavin Newsom right now, Governor Tony Evers also went up against President Donald Trump over the issue of calling out the National Guard during civil unrest. In the case of Evers, it happened 5 years ago in Kenosha, but unlike Newsom, Evers did call out the Guard on his own. Right now, Evers says his main concern is for the people who are undocumented and work in Wisconsin. This includes many dairy farms where the governor says might not be able to operate if deportation efforts are expanded, which could impact tens of thousands of people.
I'm trying to follow this as much as possible. If there's a turning point now where, instead of finding people that committed crimes and sending them back home, who can be against that? I'm all in favor for that. But if suddenly it's people that aren't appropriately documented or are waiting to be documented, and they're picked up because they don't have a document, and that makes them a criminal, that's just bullshit, frankly.
I also asked the governor about the breakdown negotiations with Republican leadership over the biennial budget. Tonight at 5, hear what he said, plus how the GOP responded in a news conference just a short time ago. Cami, back to you.